A waitress living a quiet life hides a dangerous past, but when a group of drunk troublemakers push her too far, they uncover a secret that could change everything. And the one man she thought she'd never face again steps out of the shadows. The bar was a chaos of clinking glasses, shouted orders, and bursts of laughter. Clara weaved through the crowd, her movements practiced and efficient as she carried trays of drinks to tables packed with celebrants. It was New Year's Eve, and the entire city seemed to have crammed itself into this one venue. Music pulsed through the air, a relentless beat matching the frenzied energy of the crowd. Clara felt invisible, and that was just how she liked it. "Hey, over here," a man called, his voice slurring with alcohol. Without breaking stride, Clara approached the table, her neutral expression a mask she had perfected over years of serving people in all states of sobriety. The man waved a hand wildly. "Another round, sweetheart." "Coming right up," Clara replied, her voice steady but detached, before retreating to the bar. She knew this job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept her out of the spotlight. That was the most important thing. She'd chosen this life. Quiet, unassuming, and safe. Yet on nights like this, when the noise of the world seemed impossible to shut out, she couldn't help but feel a pang of longing for something different. The door burst open, and a group of rowdy young men stumbled in, their loud voices cutting through the din. Clara noticed them immediately. They weren't hard to miss, boisterous, laughing too loudly, and clearly already drunk. The leader of the group, a tall man with dark hair and a cocky grin, swaggered to the bar. He threw an arm around the bartender, a gesture that was too familiar, too comfortable, for someone she didn't recognize as a regular. "Happy New Year," he shouted, raising his hand in a mock toast. His friends cheered, their voices merging into a cacophony that made Clara's head throb. She turned her attention back to her tray, picking up another round of drinks and carefully balancing them as she moved through the throng. But she felt it, the prickling awareness of eyes on her. She glanced up, her gaze meeting that of the dark-haired man. He smirked, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he had found a new target for the night's entertainment. Clara quickly looked away, her heart sinking. She had seen men like him before, and she knew the type of trouble they brought. As the night wore on, the bar grew even more crowded, the air thick with the scent of sweat, alcohol, and anticipation. Midnight was approaching, and the energy was almost electric. Clara focused on her work, ignoring the occasional catcall or clumsy attempt at flirtation. She moved with purpose, her mind set on getting through the night without incident. But then, as she passed by the group of rowdy men, she caught a snippet of their conversation. "She's cute, isn't she?" one of them said, his voice dripping with mischief. "Yeah," the leader replied, his tone mocking. "But she's too good for us, huh? Look at her, all serious and stuck up." Clara's grip tightened on her tray, but she kept walking. She couldn't afford to react, not tonight. Behind her, the laughter grew louder, a cruel undertone cutting through the festive cheer. Clara took a deep breath, focusing on the bar ahead. The clock was ticking closer to midnight, and she just had to make it a little longer. She could endure this. She had to. The music shifted, a countdown beginning. The crowd roared in unison, their voices rising to a crescendo. Clara's heart beat in time with the chant. 10, 9, 8. She glanced back toward the rowdy group. The dark-haired man raised his glass, his grin predatory, as if he already knew the game he wanted to play. 7, 6, 5. Clara turned away, her jaw set. She had survived worse than this. 4, 3, 2. The bar erupted into cheers, confetti raining down like a storm of celebration. Clara remained rooted to the spot, her tray steady in her hands, as the night took its inevitable turn. Clara's hope for the group to lose interest in her was dashed within minutes. The leader, whom one of his friends called Marcos, seemed intent on making her night miserable. His loud voice and exaggerated movements drew attention, but it was the way he kept watching her, like a predator sizing up its prey, that set her on edge. She returned to their table with a tray of drinks, her face carefully neutral. As she placed the glasses down, Marcos leaned forward, his grin widening. "You don't smile much, do you?" he said, loud enough for his friends to hear. They laughed on cue, their amusement like a sharp jab. Clara straightened and met his gaze briefly. "Is there anything else you need?" "Oh, plenty," Marcos replied, his tone thick with insinuation. His friends erupted into laughter again, one of them clapping Marcos on the back like he'd just delivered the joke of the century. Ignoring the comment, Clara turned to leave, but as she stepped away, a splash of cold liquid hit her back. She froze, the sharp scent of beer filling her nose. Laughter erupted behind her, louder and crueler this time. "Oh no, my hand slipped," Marcos said mockingly, holding up his empty glass. His friends were practically doubled over, tears streaming down their faces from the hilarity of it all. Clara clenched her fists, willing herself to stay calm. She'd dealt with difficult customers before, and reacting now would only give them more power. She grabbed a towel from the bar, wiped her uniform as best she could, and continued working. But Marcos wasn't done. Every time she approached their table, he found a new way to push her buttons. His comments became increasingly inappropriate, his tone dripping with mockery. Clara endured it all in silence, her focus locked on making it through the shift. Then, as she bent to pick up an empty glass from their table, one of his friends reached out and bumped her arm. The movement was slight, but it was enough to push her sleeve up, exposing the edge of a tattoo on her forearm. It was a small, intricate design that Clara usually kept hidden, a piece of her past she didn't want anyone to see. "Hey, what's that?" one of the men asked, his voice suddenly curious. He leaned closer, squinting at the tattoo as if trying to place it. Clara tugged her sleeve back down and stepped away, her expression betraying nothing. "It's nothing. Enjoy your drinks." But the group wasn't satisfied with her curt dismissal. They exchanged glances, their laughter quieting for the first time that night. Marcos leaned back in his chair, studying her with a new intensity. "Looks like there's more to you than meets the eye," he said, his tone low and almost conspiratorial. "I wonder what else you're hiding." Clara's stomach churned, but she kept her face impassive. Without another word, she turned and walked away, the weight of their eyes following her across the room. She focused on the other customers, pouring drinks and taking orders, but the knot of unease in her chest only tightened. As the night dragged on, she could feel their presence like a shadow in the room. The laughter and music blurred together, the festive energy turning sour in her mind. By the time the clock struck 1, the group had quieted, their earlier antics replaced with hushed conversations and sidelong glances in her direction. Clara tried to shake it off, but something told her this wasn't over. She had seen the look in Marcos's eyes, the sharp glint of someone who had found a puzzle he wanted to solve, no matter the cost. When her shift finally ended, she grabbed her bag and headed for the exit, the cool night air hitting her like a balm. But even as she stepped into the parking lot, the uneasy feeling lingered, wrapping around her like a second skin. The parking lot was dimly lit, the cold air biting against Clara's skin as she tightened her jacket. She could still hear the muffled thrum of music from inside the bar, but out here, the world felt eerily quiet. She walked briskly toward her car, her breath visible in the crisp night air, her steps echoing against the asphalt. As she reached her car, the faint sound of voices carried through the lot, growing louder. Clara stiffened, her instincts kicking in. She turned slightly, her eyes scanning the shadows, and her stomach dropped. Marcos and his friends had followed her, their figures emerging from the darkness like ghosts. "Well, well," Marcos drawled, his grin cutting through the gloom. "Leaving without saying goodbye?" Clara's heart raced, but she kept her face neutral, her hands tightening around her bag. "The bar's closed. You should go home." "Ah, but we're not done with you yet," Marcos said, his voice laced with mockery. His friends chuckled, spreading out to form a loose semicircle around her. The parking lot suddenly felt much smaller, the shadows closing in. Clara glanced toward the street, calculating the distance. It was too far to run without them catching her. Her car was locked, and reaching for her keys would mean taking her eyes off them, a risk she couldn't afford. Marcos stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "You're a tough one, aren't you? All quiet and mysterious. Makes me wonder what else you're hiding." "Leave me alone," Clara said, her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her chest. "Or what?" Marcos taunted, his smirk widening. "You gonna call for help? Scream, maybe?" The others laughed, their voices bouncing off the concrete. Clara's jaw tightened. She could feel the situation escalating, the air thick with unspoken threats. Then, Marcos reached out, his hand brushing against her arm, testing her boundaries. That was his mistake. In a flash, Clara moved. Her hand shot out, grabbing Marcos's wrist and twisting it sharply. He yelped, the sound more of surprise than pain, as she stepped forward, driving her shoulder into his chest and sending him stumbling backward. "What the?" one of his friends started, but Clara didn't wait. She pivoted, her movements precise and fluid, striking another man in the knee with a well-placed kick. He crumpled to the ground with a grunt, clutching his leg. The remaining two hesitated, their confidence faltering as they realized Clara wasn't the easy target they had assumed. "You crazy bitch!" one of them shouted, but he didn't advance, his bravado wavering. Marcos recovered quickly, his face a mask of rage. "You think you're tough?" he spat, lunging toward her. Clara sidestepped his attack, her movements smooth and controlled, as if she had rehearsed them 100 times. She grabbed the back of his jacket and used his momentum against him, slamming him into the side of her car. He groaned, the impact knocking the wind out of him. The others froze, their eyes wide. One of them muttered, "What the hell is she?" Clara straightened, her breathing steady, her gaze locked on Marcos. "I told you to leave me alone," she said, her voice calm but firm. Marcos glared at her, his chest heaving. For a moment, it seemed like he might lunge at her again, but then one of his friends grabbed his arm. "Let's go, man," he urged, his voice tinged with fear. "She's not worth it." Marcos hesitated, his pride warring with his sense of self-preservation. Finally, he wrenched his arm free and stepped back, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't over," he growled. Clara didn't respond, her expression unyielding. She watched as the group retreated, their bravado crumbling with each step they took away from her. When they were gone, she let out a slow breath, her body still humming with adrenaline. As she slid into her car, her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. She had handled the situation, but she knew this was just the beginning. Marcos wasn't the type to let this go, and she had just made herself a target. The night was silent once more, but the weight of what had happened lingered. Clara started the engine, her mind already bracing for what might come next. The drive home was uneventful, but Clara's mind raced, her thoughts circling back to the encounter in the parking lot. The way Marcos had looked at her before leaving wasn't something she could shake easily. It wasn't just anger, it was recognition, like he had seen something in her he couldn't quite place. And then there was the tattoo. She glanced down at her arm, the faint outline barely visible beneath her sleeve, and frowned. The apartment was dark and quiet when she arrived. She locked the door behind her, triple-checking it before turning on a single lamp. The soft glow illuminated the sparsely furnished room. Clara had always kept her life minimal, avoiding anything that might root her too deeply in one place. She poured herself a glass of water, her hands trembling slightly, and sat at the small table in the corner. For years, she had avoided trouble, staying under the radar, and living a life so ordinary it was almost invisible. But tonight had been a stark reminder that no matter how much she tried to outrun her past, it had a way of finding her. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. She picked it up cautiously, her stomach tightening as she saw an unknown number flash across the screen. She didn't answer, but the moment it stopped buzzing, a notification appeared, a voicemail. With a sinking feeling, she pressed play. "You think you're so smart," a familiar voice drawled, laced with venom. "But I know who you are now. That tattoo, it's all the proof I need. I'll see you again, Clara. Count on it." Her chest tightened as she recognized Marcos's voice. He sounded smug, confident, like someone who had just uncovered a secret he couldn't wait to exploit. Clara set the phone down, her mind racing. The tattoo, of course. She had been so careful to keep it hidden, but one slip was all it took. The symbol on her arm wasn't just ink, it was a mark, a piece of a story she had spent years trying to bury. She stood and walked to the small mirror hanging near the door. For a moment, she stared at her reflection, searching for the woman she had once been. She barely recognized herself anymore. The last time she had truly felt like herself was during the Phantom Heist, the infamous robbery that had made her a legend and a fugitive. No one had ever discovered her identity, and she had intended to keep it that way. But now, someone had seen the tattoo, someone who seemed determined to connect the dots. The sharp knock at the door made her heart leap into her throat. She froze, her breath catching as she stared at the handle. The knock came again, louder this time. Slowly, she moved to the side of the door, staying out of view. "Clara," a voice called, low and cautious. "It's me." She frowned, recognizing the voice. It belonged to one of her few trusted contacts, Diego, an old friend who had helped her lay low after the heist. She opened the door just enough to see his face, her tension easing slightly. "What are you doing here?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Diego stepped inside, his expression grim. "I heard something tonight. Marcos has been running his mouth, talking about the phantom. He's convinced it's you. Clara exhaled sharply, the weight of his words pressing down on her. He doesn't have proof, she said, but even as the words left her mouth, they felt hollow. Diego shook his head. He doesn't need proof. People like him, they just need a good story to believe in, and you gave him one. Clara sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. I can't let this happen. If he spreads this. You need to be careful, Diego interrupted. The kind of people Marcos is talking to? They'll come looking for you, and they won't stop until they find you. Clara looked up at him, her resolve hardening. She had spent years running, but now it seemed her past had finally caught up. And if that was the case, she would need to decide, run again or fight back. Marcos sat in the corner of a dimly lit room, his phone glowing in his hand as he scrolled through his contacts. His jaw was tight, his mind replaying the humiliation in the parking lot. Clara wasn't just some waitress with a bad attitude. She was hiding something big. That tattoo on her arm confirmed it. He didn't know the full story yet, but he didn't need to. Not when he knew people who could do the digging for him. Clara, he muttered under his breath, her name laced with contempt. His fingers hovered over the name of a man he hadn't spoken to in months, Arturo, a local fixer with connections in the city's darker corners. Marcos hesitated for only a second before tapping the call button. Who is this? Arturo's gruff voice answered. It's Marcos. I need a favor, he said, his tone dripping with confidence. Arturo chuckled, the sound low and menacing. Favors aren't free, my friend. What do you want? There's a girl, Marcos began, leaning back in his chair. Clara. She works at that bar on 5th. I need to know everything about her. Where she's from, who she is, and what she's hiding. There was a pause on the line. And what makes you think she's hiding something? Trust me, Marcos said, his grin returning. She's not who she pretends to be. I want dirt on her, something I can use. Arturo exhaled, the sound crackling through the phone. It'll cost you. Money's not an issue, Marcos replied quickly. Just get me what I need. As the call ended, Marcos felt a surge of satisfaction. Arturo would find something. He always did. And once he had the ammunition, Marcos would make sure Clara paid for embarrassing him. Meanwhile, Clara's instincts told her that Marcos wasn't letting things go. Days passed, but the uneasy feeling of being watched never left her. She noticed small things. Cars parked too long near her building, strangers loitering near the bar, and the bartender Javier, avoiding her gaze more than usual. Something was off. One evening, Clara confronted Javier as the bar emptied out. What's going on? She asked, her voice low but firm. Javier flinched, glancing around as if someone might overhear. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Clara snapped. You've been acting weird all week. Did someone ask you about me? Javier hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor. Look, I didn't tell them anything, okay? But yeah, some guy came around asking questions. He offered money. Clara's stomach sank. What did you say? Nothing, I swear, Javier insisted. But he knows something, Clara. I don't know how, but he knows. She nodded, her jaw tightening. The pieces were falling into place. Marcos wasn't just spreading rumors, he was digging into her past. And if he had gone so far as to bribe people, it was only a matter of time before the wrong person gave him what he wanted. That night, Clara packed a bag, her movements quick and deliberate. She couldn't stay in her apartment any longer. She had to disappear again, just like she'd done before. But as she zipped the bag closed, a thought stopped her. Running had kept her alive all these years, but it hadn't solved anything. Marcos would keep looking, and if he found what he was searching for, he wouldn't stop until she was cornered. Leaving now might delay the inevitable, but it wouldn't prevent it. For the first time in years, Clara felt the stirrings of her old self, the one who didn't back down, who planned every move 3 steps ahead. If Marcos wanted to uncover her secrets, then she would need to take control before he got too close. As she stepped into the night, the weight of her decision settled over her. She wasn't going to run, not this time. If Marcos wanted a fight, she would bring it to him. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that made Clara's every step echo louder than it should. The streets she walked were dimly lit, her silhouette blending into the shadows. The bag she carried was light, packed only with essentials. She hadn't planned on being gone for long, not this time. She stopped under the glow of a flickering street lamp and glanced around. The parking lot was just ahead, the perfect spot for what she suspected was coming. Her instincts had been screaming all day, a feeling she had learned to trust over the years. Someone was watching her. They had been since she left the bar. As she reached the lot, she paused, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she heard it, a faint shuffle of footsteps behind her. Clara's grip tightened around the strap of her bag as she turned slowly, her heart steady but her muscles taut. "Clara!" A familiar voice called out, low and mocking. Marco stepped into view, his grin wide, his confidence radiating like a predator who thought he had already won. Behind him, his friends fanned out, their expressions a mix of bravado and unease. They had numbers on their side, but the memory of their last encounter lingered in their minds. "You've been busy," Clara said, her voice calm but edged with steel. Marcos chuckled, spreading his arms as if to say, "Of course. I told you this wasn't over. Did you really think you could humiliate me and walk away?" Clara didn't respond. Instead, she subtly shifted her stance, her feet aligning for balance. Her eyes darted to her surroundings, cataloging every exit, every obstacle. She had learned long ago that the key to survival was preparation. "See, I did some digging," Marcos continued, stepping closer. "That tattoo of yours? It's famous. You're famous." His grin widened, his tone turning darker. "Or at least you used to be. The Phantom Heist, right? Everyone's heard of it, but no one's ever found the mastermind. Until now." Clara's jaw tightened, but she didn't let his words rattle her. She had been exposed before and escaped. She could do it again. Marcos gestured to his friends and they moved in closer, their formation tightening like a net. Clara remained still, her breathing slow and controlled. "Here's the deal," Marcos said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You tell me everything, who you worked with, where the money went. Maybe I let you walk away." Clara tilted her head, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "You're in over your head, Marcos. You don't know what you're dealing with." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment Marcos's confidence wavered. But then he sneered, his bravado flaring. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm dealing with. A waitress pretending to be something she's not." He lunged forward, his hand reaching for her arm, but Clara was ready. She sidestepped effortlessly, her movements fluid as she swung her bag up, the weight of its contents catching him off guard. The impact sent him stumbling, a string of curses spilling from his lips. The others hesitated for a split second, but then they charged. Clara moved quickly, her body a blur of precision and force. She used their momentum against them, dodging blows and striking with practiced accuracy. Her bag slipped from her grasp as one of them tackled her, and she hit the ground hard. Pain radiated through her side, but Clara didn't stop. She rolled, her elbow connecting with her attacker's jaw. He fell back, groaning. But before she could rise, another grabbed her from behind. She twisted, slamming her heel into his shin, but the scuffle had slowed her. Marcos loomed over her, his grin returning. "Not so tough now, are you?" he sneered, raising his fist. A sharp whistle cut through the air, freezing everyone in place. Clara's gaze snapped toward the source, and her breath caught. A figure stepped out of the shadows, their silhouette familiar yet unexpected. "Enough," the voice said firmly. Marcos hesitated, his confidence faltering as the figure stepped into the light. Clara's eyes widened as she recognized him. "Gabrielle," she murmured. The man gave her a quick nod, his expression unreadable. "Let her go," he said, his tone calm but commanding. Marcos stared at Gabriel, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. After a tense moment, he gestured for his friends to back off. They retreated slowly, dragging their injured along with them. "This isn't over," Marcos spat, glaring at Clara before disappearing into the night. Clara remained on the ground, catching her breath as Gabriel offered her a hand. She hesitated, then took it, allowing him to pull her up. "You have a lot of explaining to do," he said, his voice low but firm. Clara nodded, the weight of the night pressing down on her. "I know." Gabriel stood in the faint glow of a nearby street lamp, his posture calm but watchful. Clara hadn't seen him in years, but his presence felt like a jolt from another life, a life she had buried long ago. His dark eyes scanned her, reading her as if no time had passed. "You're slipping, Clara," he said, his voice carrying a hint of reprimand. "Getting cornered like that? That's not the Clara I knew." "I didn't exactly invite them," she replied, brushing the dirt from her clothes. "What are you doing here?" Gabriel shrugged, the movement casual, but his gaze remained sharp. "I heard whispers. Your name coming up in the wrong circles. Figured I'd check in before things got worse. Clara sighed, leaning against the wall to steady herself. It's already worse. Marcos won't stop. He's digging into my past. Gabriel's jaw tightened, a flicker of concern crossing his face. And if he digs deep enough, you know what he'll find. You're not safe here. She looked away, her mind racing. I've been running for years, Gabriel. I thought I could start over, but it's never enough. You can't outrun this forever, he said, his voice softening. You have two choices, disappear again or face it head on. Clara met his gaze, the weight of his words sinking in. Gabriel had always been the one who understood her, the one who could see through her defenses. But even now, she wasn't sure she had it in her to fight back. Let me help you, Gabriel said, his tone resolute. You don't have to do this alone. Clara hesitated, then nodded. Okay, but if we're doing this, we end it for good. The bar was packed again, a New Year's Eve crowd that thrummed with energy and anticipation. Clara moved through the chaos with purpose, her mind sharp and her plan set. She had spent the last 2 days preparing for this moment, and now it was time to execute it. Gabriel sat at a corner table, his presence unobtrusive but watchful. He nursed a drink, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of trouble. The plan was simple. Lure Marcos into a situation where he thought he was in control, then expose him for the predator he was. The key was ensuring there were plenty of witnesses. Marcos arrived later than Clara had expected, but his entrance was as loud and obnoxious as ever. He swaggered into the bar with his entourage, his grin wide as he surveyed the room. When his eyes landed on Clara, his expression shifted, his grin turning predatory. Clara didn't flinch. She met his gaze, a small, calculated smirk tugging at her lips. She needed him to think she wasn't afraid, that she had underestimated him. Marcos sauntered to the bar, ordering drinks for his group while keeping one eye on Clara. She moved closer, pretending to clean the counter nearby. You look like you've been planning something, she said, her tone light but pointed. He chuckled, leaning in. Maybe I have. And maybe it's your turn to lose. Clara tilted her head, feigning amusement. We'll see about that. The minutes stretched into an hour, the tension building as Clara led Marcos deeper into her trap. She maneuvered him toward the bar's central area where cameras covered every angle, and the crowd provided the perfect audience. Gabriel signaled from his corner, giving her a subtle nod. Everything was in place. Marcos grew bolder, his tone louder and his gestures more aggressive. Clara let him think he was gaining the upper hand, all while baiting him further. When he finally overstepped, grabbing her wrist and pulling her close, Clara made her move. Let go, she said, her voice sharp and carrying through the room. The bar quieted, all eyes turning to them. Marcos froze, caught in the sudden spotlight. Clara pulled free, her movements deliberate as she stepped back. You've had your fun, now it's over. The crowd murmured, the energy shifting. Gabriel stood, his imposing figure drawing attention. I think you've made a mistake, he said, his voice calm but commanding. Marcos faltered, realizing too late that the tide had turned. The bar was eerily silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Marcos stood frozen, his grip on Clara's wrist still visible to the crowd. His cocky grin faltered as he realized all eyes were on him, the confidence draining from his face like a broken dam. You should really let go now, Gabriel said from behind him, his voice calm, but carrying a quiet threat. He stepped closer, his presence casting a long shadow over the scene. Marcos's hand dropped, his bravado wavering as he looked between Clara and Gabriel. What's this? He sneered, trying to recover. You two playing hero and damsel? Cute! Clara didn't flinch. She had already rehearsed this moment in her mind. This isn't about playing anything, Marcos, she said, her voice firm but level. It's about you finally facing the consequences of your actions. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, the tension crackling in the air. Clara knew the bar's regulars. Many had witnessed Marcos's provocations over the past few nights. Some had turned a blind eye, but now with the cameras rolling and Gabriel's imposing figure standing guard, the tide was shifting. Marcos laughed nervously, gesturing to his friends. What are you all looking at? She's just a waitress trying to act tough. Clara took a step forward, her eyes locking with his. You think you can bully people and get away with it, but tonight, everyone sees you for who you are. Gabriel raised his voice, addressing the crowd. How many of you have seen him do this before? Harassing staff, picking fights, treating people like garbage? A few people nodded hesitantly, their murmurs turning into scattered affirmations. Marcos's friends shifted uncomfortably, some taking small steps backward to disassociate themselves. "Enough of this!" Marcos snapped, his voice rising in desperation. He lunged at Clara, his movements reckless, but Clara was ready. She sidestepped smoothly, twisting his arm and forcing him to the ground in one fluid motion. The crowd gasped, a ripple of shock and awe spreading through the room. "Stay down," she said coldly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The room erupted into cheers and applause, the crowd emboldened by Marcos's public humiliation. Gabriel stood nearby, his arms crossed, watching as the scene unfolded. The bar's cameras captured everything, ensuring that this moment would live far beyond the night. Marcos, his pride shattered, glared up at Clara, but he didn't move. He knew he had lost. The bar hummed with post-midnight energy, but for Clara, the world felt strangely still. Marcos had been escorted out by the crowd, his bravado and threats muted under the weight of public humiliation. His friends had scattered, their loyalty dissolving in the face of Clara's quiet strength and Gabriel's presence. She stood at the bar, leaning against the counter as the adrenaline began to ebb. Gabriel approached, handing her a glass of water. "You handled that well," he said, his tone calm and approving. Clara took a sip, her hand trembling slightly. "It's over," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "For now," Gabriel said, his voice tinged with caution. "Guys like him don't forget, but you made a statement tonight." The words hung in the air and Clara nodded. She knew this victory was temporary. Marcos might retreat for now, but he would regroup. Still, for the first time in years, she felt something close to relief. She had faced the storm, and she was still standing. The crowd began to thin as the night wore on, but the buzz lingered. Several patrons came up to Clara, offering quiet words of support or apologizing for not stepping in sooner. She accepted their words with a nod, though her focus remained inward. As the clock crept closer to dawn, Clara and Gabriel stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The streets were quiet now, confetti from the night's celebration scattered along the pavement. Clara inhaled deeply, the cool air grounding her. "What now?" Gabriel asked, leaning against the wall. Clara looked out at the horizon, where the faintest hint of light was beginning to break. "I keep moving forward," she said. "No more running, no more hiding." Gabriel smiled faintly. "Good. You're stronger than you think, Clara." She turned to him, her expression softening. "Thanks for coming back." "I never really left," he replied, his voice steady. "I'll be around if you need me." Clara nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. As Gabriel disappeared into the shadows, she turned and began walking. The city was waking up, and so was she. Before she reached the corner, she noticed something tucked under her windshield wiper, a small envelope. She hesitated, her heartbeat quickening as she opened it. Inside was a single note, written in neat, anonymous handwriting. "Still watching, still waiting. We're not done yet." Clara stared at the note, her resolve hardening. The past wasn't finished with her, but neither was she finished with it. As the sun rose, Clara stepped into the new day, ready for whatever came next. Sometimes life corners us with choices: fight, run, or confront the ghosts of our past. Clara's journey reminds us that bravery isn't about being unshakable. It's about facing fear, even when the odds are stacked against us. How would you have handled her situation? Would you have stood your ground or chosen a different path entirely? Click the video on your screen to dive deeper into Clara's story and discover what it takes to truly embrace your strength. Don't forget to subscribe and join us for more gripping tales that challenge the way we see ourselves and the world around us. See you in the next chapter.